Hello and welcome to the Controversies in Church History podcast. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. This is a reminder that you can find controversies in church history on various social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also on Patreon. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, this is a free podcast for most people. I try to make it available through as many platforms and different types of social media as I can, but I do actually try to advertise every once in a while. I do have a few expenses for doing this, and it is a lot of work. So this is supposed to be a service. You're not supposed to you don't have to do this, but if you'd like to become a patron of our podcast, go to patreon.com and you'll find our Patreon page on Patreon, where you can become a donor, a monthly donor. I think it's $5, $7, and $10 to help out defray some of the cost of this stuff. Going forward, I'm going to start doing more things, interviews of those sorts of nature for patrons on Patreon, to focus more on that. So if you want to keep supporting the podcast, keep it going. All the episodes, in terms of the archive of what I've done, will be available free. Eventually they'll be made after a month or so, all the new ones. But if you become a patron, you get new episodes a month in advance. You get some other things, bonus features that I won't make available. All the regular episodes will be available to all people. So just to help out and say thank you to some of my donors. So if you'd like to do that, please go to patreon.com and think about signing up. Thank you and God bless. Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. My name is Derek Taylor, your host for this podcast. Thank you to all the listeners for listening to the podcast. Thank you especially to our patrons on Patreon for becoming patrons of the podcast. Really appreciate it. Controversies in Church History is a podcast which goes through all the most interesting, important, and controversial events in the life of the Roman Catholic Church, and is made possible by listeners. If I didn't have listeners, I wouldn't do this, but I am doing it as a service to y'all. So thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. Hope you get something out of it. Happy New Year to everyone, to all my listeners. Last time I recorded something, it was still 2023. It's 2024 now. Blessings and a wonderful and hopefully prosperous and happy New Year to you all in 2024. Our latest episode we have for you now in this recording is on the liturgical movement. It's titled "What Happened to the Liturgical Movement?" And we have in this episode, it's about the liturgical movement. If you're listening to this, you probably know what this is. But if you don't, for people who don't, liturgical movement was a movement among priests and theologians and monks. And, it goes back to the 19th century, but I'm going to focus on the 20th century mostly in this episode, which sought to reform the liturgy prior to the Second Vatican Council. And it had its effect. This is what feeds into the Second Vatican Council. Its primary document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and to this day, basically, the sort of official line of most people is that this was a triumph of the liturgical movement. The actual reforms that happened were a triumph of the liturgical movement. Of course, you have people who disagree with this official line. This is the traditionalist line mostly, that no, something went really wrong with the liturgical movement, and so that its original aims weren't realized by that reform or even by Sacrosanctum Concilium. And I should mention, it's not only traditionalists, but people who came to that conclusion. One of whom, of course, most famously was Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope. It's one of the reasons why he actually tried to liberalize use of the older rite. But the question becomes, if you don't think of the history of the liturgical movement, by the way, most histories of it are written by people who think the liturgical movement was a great success and that the reforms of the Second Vatican Council have been a great success. So they naturally want to tell that story. If you don't believe that, you have to explain something, which is because most everyone believes that in its origins, the liturgical movement was a good thing. There were good fruits coming out of it. If you don't, and this is the traditionalist line, is that okay, something must have gone wrong somewhere. What was it? And I'm going to give my answer to this here. There are various ways you can talk about this, reasons for this. And again, we're not talking, by the way, in this about the actual reforms that happened after Vatican II. It's a different subject, and so we'll leave that to one side for the most part. And the goal on this is basically, because again, this kind of goes back to questions of what do you think about the reforms.
Um, I can understand, I guess, liking the reforms themselves, thinking they were good. But I'm going to presume, go on the assumption here that they mark a break with the older liturgy. Again, you have people defending this today that, there's no difference between the older and the new liturgies, the old and new Roman Missal, and I think that's not defensible intellectually. They really are different things. That's kind of the question I want to answer here: is how did something that was once unthinkable, and what was unthinkable was before the 1960s, was there was something so wrong with the Roman liturgical tradition that it needed to be basically swept aside and replaced. That is what happened, by the way, in the 60s. Every single liturgical book was basically chucked out, a new one was put in its place for every service within a 10-year period. And so that's what I'm gonna try to answer here. I'm gonna give you a potted history, a short history of this, and talk about what I think happened as we go along. But in any event, that's what we're going to talk about here today. So let me start off with a sort of background on this. Again, you can date the liturgical movement in different ways, not like an official starting date. I'm going to get to the 20th century in a second. You pretty much have to start with the 19th century, I think, though, just on background. Because the person who's usually identified as trying to sort of restore the liturgy is a guy named Dom Prosper Guéranger, who was a Benedictine monk, monastery of Solesmes he's associated with in the 19th century. These are the monks that basically restored or tried to restore the singing of Gregorian chant in the Catholic Church. And this has to do with a perception at the time that something had gone wrong with the liturgy. And obviously this is all this is about, right? In France particularly, Guéranger was obviously French. Problems with the liturgy in the 17th and 18th centuries with, there were lots of experiments, for example, with the rites, at a diocesan level in France. The influence of Jansenism, if you know what that is, a 17th century movement, tried to simplify the rites. In some places, put it in their vernacular. Also in other places, certain places you'll have the influence of the secular government in places like Austria having an effect on liturgy. But also things like the introduction of what amounts to secular music, concert music into the Mass. This is where you get things like, Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, which is lovely, but for the most part, you're introducing, what is not sacred music into the liturgy. And so, especially in the aftermath of the French Revolution in France, the church is kind of in a shambles. And Dom Prosper Guéranger, his solution to all this is a restoration of the Roman Rite in general, and also specifically in musical terms, that of Gregorian chant. And he's famous for this. And of course, this will be taken up by Pius IX. This is in the middle of the 19th century. This is the era of Ultramontanism, where appealing to the papacy is something people are increasingly doing because of the situation of their countries in Europe. And so it gets taken up by the papacy and become part of this. This is part of the story as well as the growing both influence but later assertion of papal control over the liturgy, which they've been doing that since the Reformation, but that'll become part of the story as well. One thing that tends to get left out of this, because Guéranger, everyone agrees with Guéranger's centrality to the story. One thing people don't, I think, emphasize enough, maybe some people have, I didn't read every single thing about this for this podcast, but he was born in a time in which Romanticism he lived in a time in which Romanticism had a lot of real effect on the church in France, especially. In the early 1800s, 1802, I think, there was a book written by a man named René Chateaubriand, who was he was a Catholic. He was also a conservative politician in the Restoration France. He wrote a book called The Genius of Christianity. And this book was really impactful when he published it. And the idea of the book was basically that the genius of Christianity was not its doctrines, not the truth of it, not its doctrine, not its teachings, but the beauty of its liturgy. And I mention this because he sets in motion something I think is very influential, something the Romanticism, if you know what this is an intellectual movement, is a reaction against the Enlightenment, against the sort of overweening rationalism of Enlightenment thinking. In particular, the sort of tendency of the Enlightenment to exalt reason at the expense of feeling, but also to exalt a sort of, atomizing reason. Reason sort of chops things up into categories. Romantic thinkers wanted to see the world whole, and they usually appeal to, not usually, but often would at times appeal to the past in a search for a sense of, holism or a holistic view of the world and stuff like this. And one of the things they put a lot of emphasis on, of course, romantic thinkers, was feeling, right? And the emotional states are really important for romanticism. And I think through Chateaubriand, you get this idea coming into the church. I think I can't prove this, but that liturgy and worship are a matter of psychological experience. That is to say, they're supposed to induce some sort of experience in you, which I think it's actually a problem. I also think you get people, and I think people know Garanger is affected by Romanticism, but I'm thinking this because the contemporary debates about what liturgy is supposed to be seem very idealistic to me, almost kind of romanticized. I'll explain more what I mean by that in a second, but I think Romanticism is sort of lurking in the background of this discussion, historically speaking. And it certainly had an impact in France in the early part of the 1800s. And I should mention this, but nobody mentions this about Garanger, right, because he's a revered figure, but he was definitely caught up in that. Early in his career, or in his life, Garanger early on, he was a follower of the Abbé de Lamennais. If you know who Lamennais was, he was a key figure in early 19th century France. Was a founder of liberal Catholicism, eventually got condemned later on in the 1840s. Garanger never mentions him in any of his writings, apparently, but, Lamennais was definitely influenced by this Romanticism. So again, there's this relationship there that I think you should keep in the back of your mind. But anyway, Dom Garanger, the Congregation of Solesmes, they do a couple of things. They try to push for excuse me, the restoration of the Roman Rite in France, which succeeds over time. They basically rid them of Gallican liturgies. But they also begin the study of liturgy, and this is something to be key to what I'm talking about here. He founds, the year of his death in 1875, a journal called Institution Liturgique, which is meant to propagate a more serious academic study of the liturgy. And again, to give you a little context about this, 1875 is a seminal year in the history of the church in France, because there had been in official government-funded universities up till then, departments of theology. In other words, the government had sponsored these things itself at its own expense. A liberal government took over in 1875, and they basically expelled I'm dumbing this down for the sake of time, theology faculties from government schools. The church had to open their own schools at that point. And I'm mentioning this because one of my theses here is that this is one of the things that leads to ultimately a change in the way people view the liturgy. What's happening is you're having the founding of liturgical journals and stuff like this. You're going to have the creation of centers for the academic study of the liturgy in the Catholic Church, and I think this sort of what I'll call is the professionalization of the study of liturgy is a key thing, and I'll come back to this. But in any event, he dies in 1875. This continues after his death, obviously. You also have the coming to the throne of St. Pius X being important for this, because he's also an advocate for the restoration of Gregorian chant. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I think it's Trelas. I can't remember the document he issues, but basically he wants to restore Gregorian chant to its pride place. So he takes this up. This is important, of course, because this being the era of ultramontanism, even hyper-papalism, getting papal authority behind something, means it's probably going to happen, or at least an attempt at it's going to happen. And it's in fact from Pius X's writing that you actually get this controversial term. It's controversial now. Active participation. Actually, what he says, the term is, I believe I got the Latin right here. Somebody will correct me if I don't get this right, but it's participatio actuosa that he mentions. That the goal of this restoration of the liturgy, of the authentic Roman liturgy, is to get people to take more interest in the liturgy. There's this sense that's widespread. People just aren't that interested, that people are out there, praying their rosaries during the liturgy, the Mass, they're not really paying attention. And the idea is to get them to participate along with the priests as Mass is going on. And Pius X is part of this. One other thing I'll mention about this, and I mentioned this in conjunction with what's going on with the church in terms of, again, in France, but other places, they're having to respond to all these influences, intellectual influences in the 19th century. Things like positivism in France. This is the idea that the only real knowledge is scientific knowledge in terms of modern sciences. Stuff like this. And again, this has nothing directly to do with the liturgical movement, but all the stuff is in the background of things like the modernist crisis, where the church is trying to deal with, for the first time, the implications of modern scholarship in general, which it really hasn't done, and only starts to do at the end of the 19th century. It's something in the background, because, of course, as we're going to get to in a moment, you're going to have the beginnings of actual scholarship on the liturgy in the church, and I think there's something there in the background of all this. Excuse me, a little bit of a cold here. Okay, so what sometimes if you're talking about the modern founding of the liturgical movement, usually it's associated with Belgium, and particularly one man named Lambert Baudouin. And he's associated with a monastery, the Benedictine monastery, at Mount César, which was founded in 1899, which was founded by monks from the monastery in Belgium, which was influenced by Solesmes. A lot of this comes out of Solesmes and the Benedictine tradition. And Mount César will become, in some ways, the sort of publishing hub for the liturgical movement. It'll publish several different journals for the study of the liturgy and trying to encourage liturgy as a matter of study in the church. But Lambert Baudouin's really important. He gave an address in 1909 at Malines in Belgium, which is considered a manifesto of the liturgical movement. And he's one of these people who is most enthusiastic about, again, trying to get people to appreciate the church's liturgy. And that was his goal, by the way. His goal was not to change anything about the liturgy, but get people to understand it, to raise their consciousness of it. And one of the things about Lambert Baudouin is that he was actually part of a sort of workers' ministry, labor ministry. That is, he ministered to working people in Belgium before he got into the liturgical movement, and that became a emphasis of his life. And one of the things about this is that he gives to the liturgical movement a pastoral bent. Again, there already was this idea that you need to address the masses and educate them, but he gives what you might almost call an activist bent to this, because he was kind of obsessed with it in some ways. He put a lot of emphasis on the collective nature of the liturgy. Again, one of the things you're going to see in the liturgical movement in the 20th century is there's this idea that the liturgy has been infected by individualism. This is the idea that, well, everybody's just doing their own thing at Mass. They're just paying attention to private devotions and ignoring what's going on in the liturgy. But there's some other ideas here at work, I think, if you look at what he talks about, and I'll go over this in a second, but he put a lot of stress on the ability of the liturgy to overcome divisions in modern society. He literally thought if you got the liturgy right, it would help heal divisions in modern society. You might say, what does that mean? Well, he's talking about, he's a labor priest. He's talking about things like class divisions, national divisions, right? He's writing, his address is written in 1909 originally. This is before World War I. It'll eventually be done up and re-edited and republished later on. I think originally it was called Piety of the Church in French. It's called Liturgy of the Life of the Church. It gets published in English later in the 1930s. I'm going to talk about some of this in a second, some of the things that are important about this. But he has this idea, this very idealistic notion about the church, the liturgy being able to overcome these divisions, which I think is interesting in some ways. And so just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, and read a couple of excerpts from this, from his work as it was published in the 1930s, which is, again, called Liturgy of the Life of the Church. He expresses his goal pretty clearly in the first few pages. He says, for all the faithful, I'm quoting, for all the faithful of the church, without exception, the greatest possible active and frequent participation in the priestly life of the visible hierarchy, according to the manner prescribed in the liturgical canons, is the normal an infallible path to a solid piety, a piety that is sane, abundant, and truly Catholic, and that makes them children of their Holy Mother, the Church, in the fullest sense of this ancient and truly Christian phrase, unquote. So, again, the idea is to get people to pay attention to what's going on in the Mass, and to identify with, of course, the priestly, with the priesthood and the hierarchy, to associate them with this, to, again, raise their consciousness, if you want to put it that way, to change them rather than change the liturgy. Although you see there, by the way, you see this again, there's this idealism. It's the normal and infallible path to a silent piety. In my edition of this that I found on the internet, those words are italicized. Normal and infallible path. And if we get the liturgy right, then we'll get piety right, and it'll sort of, make everything better this way. I think a very, very, again, idealistic notion of what the liturgy is going to do once we've gotten things right. And again, I should point out here, by the way, that he doesn't mean, when he says, participation, he doesn't mean, doing things at Mass necessarily. That's what it came to me. Like the lady has to be doing something. He means that sort of identification with the priesthood, a sort of vicarious participation of it by attending the liturgy, being attentive to it, those sorts of things. So it's not the sort of idea you get later on that'll come out after the council, but he does stress this. He emphasizes this again. It's something that Pius X emphasized. So, but he begins talking about this, and in here he'll mention this stuff in this work. He says a lot of things about that are just that kind of piqued my interest about again, how people didn't pay attention to this, that their lives aren't grounded sufficiently. People's Christian lives aren't grounded sufficiently in the truths of the liturgy. And he says this about this. It's just, again, a quotation here. He says, quote, "All these truths which find expression in every liturgical act." He means truth like things like the communion of saints and all that stuff. I won't belabor those things here. He says, all these truths which find expression in every liturgical act are asleep in men's souls. The faithful have lost consciousness of them. Let us change the routine and monotonous assistant at acts of worship into an active and intelligent participation. Goes on to say, people have for centuries ignored this traditional piety. It will take them a long time to relearn it. So there is a sense that something's gone really, really wrong. He talks about things like individualism. Again, when he says individualism, he's talking about things, about what I've already mentioned. People, not paying attention at Mass, doing their own prayers and stuff like this. But again, one of the things I think he has in mind here is, like, he's a labor priest. One of the things that happens as a result of the modern industrial revolution is that society becomes very divided over class lines. Once you begin to have a middle class, which is very powerful, it tends to sort of, project its ideas everywhere. And one of these things is individualism, people being sort of, atomized, right? The atomization of society. Anomie, in the language of Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist. And he talks about this in this little work here. It's interesting, the effect of this individualism. He says, quote, "Many Christians no longer pray at all. This is the inevitable consequence of the neglect into which the liturgical prayer has fallen." So he's concerned about ordinary people, what they're doing, and has that in the background of his mind, does Dom Lambert Baudouin. And he is someone, by the way, who's very... I should mention this. He's very solicitous for people. He wants them to understand the liturgy. He's not sort of looking down on them. We'll come back to this, though. There are some ideas in this that I think contribute to what later on will become, I think, in some ways, the denigration of ordinary believers at Mass among some of these liturgical reformers. That's one aspect of this. It goes on in multiple countries. The other part I'll mention here, the other sort of stream of the liturgical movement, has its origins in Germany. This is associated with a couple of different monasteries. Again, Maria Lock is the big one. Monks from Solesmes founded a monastery at Buron in 1863 in Germany. And then monks from Buron founded a monastery called Maria Lock in 1993. And again, they carry on their efforts to make the liturgy central to people's lives. They found a bunch of journals for the study of Christian worship in 1918, after 1918, that are essential to this. So you have people studying the liturgy, sharing ideas about it. In particular, Germany is important, the German aspect of the movement, because of several ideas that get into German scholarship. One of the most famous of these is a guy named monk named Odo Cassel. The Mystery of Christian Worship, which was a little book he published in 1922. And it's a good example of, again, you had, again, these monks going from, on the one hand, in the beginning, it was these monks who were, they weren't necessarily scholars per se. They're doing this stuff as a sort of part of their, monastic vocation, where it slowly changes to something different, to a sort of the liturgy as an object of academic study. And his book was praised to the heavens at the time. It's since been basically proven to be based on faulty assumptions. The idea basically is that there was a connection of some sort between pagan mystery cults and the mystery of what he calls the mystery of Christian worship. This is the whole idea of the Paschal mystery, right? He was looking at parallels between pagan mystery cults and like the Easter Vigil and stuff like this, or the Easter liturgy, and drawing comparisons to the. He got a lot of pushback because of this, but it had a big influence because it sort of brought what some people thought the idea had been lost from the Mass, the idea of mystery, into things. And again, one of the things that'll happen in Germany over time is that this idea will come to take hold among scholars there. This is by the way where ultimately you get the whole idea of the Paschal mystery. You've heard this, of course. The idea that, again, this is the sort of sole focus of the Mass, the mystery of the Mass. Which over time, what's going to happen is that people are going to set this idea up in opposition to the idea of the Mass as a sacrifice, which is, of course, what the Council of Trent emphasized. And it's in Germany, again, not the only place, but probably the place where it's the most intense. You begin to see a trend among people studying the liturgy and the liturgical movement who see the idea that there's a falling off or a corruption of the liturgy in the medieval period, for example, comes to be seen as a culprit for this, that piety became too subjective in the Middle Ages, too focused on private devotions. Or sometimes it's later on the Baroque era, where the Baroque had this separation of traditional piety from the piety of the church because of the influence of absolute monarchies or something like this, which is responsible for people forgetting the element of mystery in the Mass and stuff like this. There was a monk and a scholar named Idelfans Erwegen, I think I'm pronouncing that right, in the 1920s, who published a couple of books that popularized this idea, especially the idea that the medieval era was actually a corruption of Christian worship, that there was too much emphasis on the idea of the Mass as sacrifice and stuff like this. And again, one of the things I need to note about this here is that one of the reasons I'm emphasizing this change to the sort of academic study of the liturgy by the church is that they're beginning to set up this study of the liturgy at a time when things are sort of very radical. Well, they've been very radical, but things are changing a lot in the sort of secular academic world. And I think you can kind of see some influences of this a little bit in the ideas that are coming out in Germany in this period, interwar period. If you don't know, the German scholarship is deeply influenced by things like historicism. You know what historicism is the idea that basically every sort of historical era is unique to itself and it's different from every other. And the idea that they're not really sort of comparable. In other words, things change with the period. And so this is, you get this idea that, the liturgy is not some, once for all, has some essential form, but it's supposed to sort of change with the times. Seems to be something that's comes out of this German milieu in the 1930s. And I don't know if there's any proof, by the way. I'm not saying there's any direct connection, but it seems like there's this idea is more prevalent in these German scholars. This idea, by the way, there's a corruption in the Middle Ages. This will get into one of the more famous scholars, actually an Austrian, I think, Joseph Jungmann, later in the 1950s. This idea that, we sort of fallen away from something because of, corruption as a sort of strong idea here. in the liturgical movement. You'll also get, again, people beginning to sort of take these ideas from the liturgical movement. And, for example, people like Romano Guardini, who's also a member of this this movement, German theologian, 1930s, they'll take these ideas and they'll, one of the things Guardini did and others in the movement is they worked on college campuses. They were chaplains. And so they try to introduce these ideas to young people to get them interested in these ideas. And, you'll have these ideas that are meant to, again, take the ideas of Baudouin, the idea of, pastoral liturgy, it's another big thing, and adapt it to their situations. And you'll get experiments with things like the dialogue mass, where you have, parts for the congregation and everything like this, all in response to this idea that we've lost the true mystery. We need to sort of raise people's consciousness by doing different things with the liturgy. Begins to creep in there. And I would be remiss, by the way, again, not just mentioning, again, things outside the church. I think people, when I read histories of this, they too much presume that the church is sort of sealed off from the rest of the world. I can kind of see some of this, by the way, being part of interwar trends in the wider world. Because in the 1920s and 30s, there's definitely a reaction in the secular world against rationalism, sort of cult of the irrational, the popularity of people of, theories of Freud, in art, the works of Salvador Dali, the influence of philosophies like vitalism. The idea of vitalism is that, it's kind of hard to explain, but the idea that sort of, life is about energy and movement and stuff like this. Henri Bergson is the guy I'm thinking of, who's actually had a lot of influence in French circles, even in the church. Some of this seems similar. I'm thinking of the emphasis of the idea of the mystery, right? That there's this non-rational thing we've abandoned in the modern world. We need to get back to it. The year after Odo Cassel wrote his work, The Mystery of Christian Worship, a German Protestant writer, Rudolf Otto, wrote a book called The Idea of the Holy, which is the idea of what is sacred as something it's necessarily non-rational. He's giving it it's a very, scholarly book, but again, it's kind of in the air, right? You have these reactions to certain trends in modern life, which lead people to say, take a second look at the liturgy in ways they hadn't before. One other thing that also begins to again, because the change we're trying to explain here is, okay, how did they go from saying, okay, we're trying to raise people's affection for and consciousness of the liturgy, going from that to, well, how do we, instead of that, changing the liturgy, in other words, to fit their consciousness, as it were. These are some of the things in the background, I think. But one of the things you have also is, and this goes back to Lambert Baudouin, Lambert Baudouin, after he became a member of this, became involved in this, also got involved in ecumenism. He was one of the people who was behind the so-called Malines Conversations in 1924, which is a series of informal talks between Baudouin and the members from the Church of England. And again, this kind of went beyond, like, the hierarchy, the Catholic hierarchy in England was not pleased with this. From what I understand, neither really the Anglican hierarchy was pleased as well, but he was very enthusiastic about this. Again, Baudouin was he was very big about overcoming divisions, and he sort of turned his attention for the rest of his life. He dies in the 1940s. He turns his attention to ecumenism, and actually sets up another monastery, I want to say in Chevreton, I think originally, in France, maybe it's in Belgium, which is dedicated to, it's dedicated to ecumenism. It's dedicated to actually the Christian East. He gains a fascination with Eastern liturgies, Eastern theology and stuff like this. It tends to take on even a little bit of an anti-Roman hue. He tends to sort of, he didn't reject anything in the church. He stayed faithful to it, but there's this very much, again, but a sort of excessive. Guy was a very excessive guy. He tended to get into a project and embrace it with his whole gusto, And this led, by the way, to the ideas of the liturgical movement getting into Protestant circles in the 1920s and 30s. And in fact, it'll reach Orthodox circles. There's a circle of Orthodox, for example, exiles from Russia after the revolution in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. And so you'll have contacts between Catholics and Orthodox because of this at that time. And in fact, Baudouin had some weird ideas. I know when they had the initial conversations with the Anglicans, he was apparently, I guess, one of the plans he had, or one of the things he, I guess, raised as a possibility was when the Anglican Church, the idea was a reunion with the Anglican Church, like literally. Hard to imagine now, obviously. But one of his proposals I read somewhere was that he proposed that all the bishoprics that had been established, the Catholic bishoprics, which had been established in the 1850s, Pius IX, there hadn't been a Catholic hierarchy in England since the Reformation. Pius IX established a bunch of bishops in the 1850s. One of his proposals was to abolish all the Catholic archbishoprics once there was a reunion. Very strange guy. And by the way, there were complaints about this as well. And there were, his monastery, I can't remember the name of it, that was dedicated to the Christian East. Several of his monks became Orthodox. So there's some weird things going on there as well. And these ideas, I should mention, by the way, migrated to the United States in the 1920s and 30s. The, brain fart. The Abbey of St. John up in Minnesota. This becomes center for liturgical movement. One of the centers in the United States, associated with the Benedictine monk Virgil Michel, was the founder of the the journal Orates Fratres. Later on, become the journal Worship, and they'll get into the United States through there. Again, Virgil Michel. There's nothing really. Again, I'm trying to suggest he did anything wrong or anything like this. It seems to have had the original aims of Lambert Baudouin in mind. But these ideas will, migrate pretty quickly from their starting points in Europe outside to the United States. In any case, there's a dividing line here, I think, in the history of the movement, which is partly due to World War II. But something changes in the post-war era. Clearly, and this is where I'm going to emphasize my thesis here, which is, I think what happens is by the time you get to the interwar period, you have the beginnings of this professionalization of the study of liturgy. And you see this after World War II, where you have all these freestanding, liturgical centers being established. The Liturgical Conference is established in the 1940 in the United States. The Centre de Pastoral Liturgique is founded in France in 1943, before the end of World War II. The Liturgical Institute in Trier is founded in 1947 in Germany. Much later on, in 1961, there'll be a Pontifical Institute of Liturgy founded in Rome at St. Anselmo, which still exists. If you don't know what St. Anselmo, it's kind of the St. Anselmo's infamous among traditionalists because it's the center of opposition to the old liturgy at this point, but founded in the post-war period. And again, I mention all this because this is where you're getting, this is my thesis here. One of my theses here is that you begin to have essentially the study of liturgy separated from the actual practice of it in places like monasteries in a lot of ways. It takes on a life of its own. And this was necessary, by the way. You needed to have some academic study of the liturgy to get, accurate knowledge about what the liturgy was like before the modern era, stuff like this. You needed this. But I think it came with certain dangers because one of the things, of course, that you do is you take on the methods. They did. They took on the methods of modern academic study. And I think there was always a danger in this for a variety of reasons. And partly because, you take these methods from the modern academy, they're not neutral. They tend to have, certain things embedded in them that are potentially harmful. Again, I mentioned one of them earlier, the whole idea of historicism, the idea that society is constantly changing from era to era, and they're just totally different eras and that sort of thing. But just in general, the sort of privileging of written sources, the denigration of oral tradition. Again, one of the things that, about Catholicism is it depends on the reliability of oral tradition. If you come to call that into question, which I think is in the background of some of this, we'll go through this in a second, talk about this more, is some of the background of the changes we're talking about. Why the liturgical movement went from, you figure we learn more about the liturgy so we can teach people about it. It goes from we learn more about liturgy, the more we dislike it and want to change it, I think, in a lot of ways. And I'll give you some quotations here in a second, stuff I've been reading. It makes me think this. But also just in general, again, people have noted this about the liturgy. The liturgy is sort of the entire faith in nuce, right? Not in sort of, propositional definitions, but in its, all of its symbols and gestures and rituals. And again, it's sort of like a holistic way of thinking of the faith, right? Through image, through symbol, through gesture, those sorts of things. Whereas just the general tenor of modern academic thought is to, again, chop things up into small bits in order to make them easier to understand. And so I think maybe part of what I'm thinking here is you begin to see in the 1950s, I think, the institutionalization of this reform movement. And I think they begin to see themselves as experts. And what do I mean by institutionalization? I mean things like, for example, they hold these, this actually started at Mount Cesar, Baudouin. This was his thing. They hold these liturgical weeks, these conferences where people get together and share ideas, encourage each other to sort of experiment in reforms and stuff like this. By the 1950s, they're holding international conferences on this stuff. And why is this important? Why is this significant? I think it's significant because what you're having is the creation of a sort of expert class, which was not the intention at all of people like Lambert and Baudouin. It was to get everybody to have the same understanding of the liturgy. Well, what you're having people is gaining more specialized knowledge of the liturgy, and it begins to create almost, at least in their minds, a sort of clerisy, a sort of clerical class that has specialized knowledge that the church needs. The liturgy won't be properly celebrated until it takes this specialized knowledge we have seriously. And more than this, it tends to create, I think, a sensibility that a sort of institutional professional identity. I guess to say they're loyal to the liturgical movement first. A sense that they have a sort of special mission to reform the liturgy. Particularly in opposition to anybody that may disagree with their ideas. And so why does this matter? What's important about this? Well, you can kind of see this in the sense that once the liturgical movement becomes this very professionalized body of, experts, they almost begin to act, at least, again, this is me interpreting all this, almost like a sort of lobbying group. Because they begin to push for more and more reforms, right? Based on the scholarship they're doing and all this stuff. And they have some success. This is where the sort of reforms come from. The papal reforms of the 1940s and 50s come from, in which the papacy reforms the Easter liturgy. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of this. I know people who get really upset about this because they really think the reforms were a big mistake. My point is that you have them. You have, once you begin to have a sort of institutionalized presence, once you know how things work in a big bureaucratic organization like the Catholic Church, it becomes easier to sort of put your case before authorities like this. And two things to remember about this, why I think this is important, this professionalization, is that if you haven't read, if you're listening to this, you might have read it already, but there's one book you ought to read about like liturgical reform from the traditionalist perspective. I say this because I remember got into a discussion on a YouTube channel, the comments with someone who basically said that all the traditionalists were all just liars who made things up. They didn't know anything. And I asked them, okay, what books did you read where people were just, making things? He didn't say that exactly, but he said something. They didn't know what they were talking about. I was like, what books did you read by these traditionalists? And he rattled off a list of books by people who defended the reforms that happened after the Second Vatican Council. He'd never actually read a book by these people. But I say this only because if by any chance anybody who's listening who's not read it, you should read Yves Chiron's biography of Annibale Buonini. Annibale Buonini, of course, was the secretary to the Concilium, the commission that put together the new liturgy after Vatican II. And one of the things Chiron said there always stuck with me is that Annibale Buonini was a good bureaucrat, and he wasn't being facetious. He meant by that he was good at organizing people. He was good at organizing committees, getting people together, getting them to work together, to do work on time, to produce stuff. And this is what kind of appears to me to be true of the liturgical movement by the time you get to the 1950s as well. They know they have a set of ideas, a set of specialized knowledge. They want to use it. They know most people don't care. Most people were opposed to this stuff or didn't care one way or the other. And what happened was, of course, they began in the 1950s to get the papacy to get on board with this, which is, of course, hugely important because one of the things that's happening in the 19th and 20th centuries is that, of course, the papacy, is taking a lot more, is insisting on its authority in these changes. And if you can get the Pope to say something, then that's basically what goes. And so I think what happens by the time you get to the 1950s, the liturgical movements almost kind of become institutionalized, with a sort of, a sense of professional esprit de corps, which is kind of like, you're familiar with the term clericalism, right? Where, clergy, look down on the laity or something like this. Well, you have that sort of sense here, but in a different sense. This idea that, because we're experts, because we have this specialized knowledge, our opponents, or especially people in the pews, they're kind of dumb. They don't know this stuff, and therefore they should listen to our ideas. And I say this because this comes out, actually, in some of these later reformers. This is one of the differences that's not there in, say, Lambert Baudouin. There's a solicitude for people in the pews. By the time you get to the 1950s, there's clearly a sense of going from, wanting to help people and raise their consciousness about the liturgy, to seeing them almost as an obstacle. And this is where I think you get, and I don't have the quotations at hand, but you get this in the immediate aftermath of the council. People saying things like, I can't remember his name, it was an English monk who was asked about what the people wanted in terms of the reforms of the liturgy, and I'm paraphrasing from memory. He said something to the effect, it doesn't matter what the people want, it was what we think is good for them. And I can find several. There are several. I found them, I've lost them, I don't have time to go doing the research at the moment. But you have a lot of this expression of contempt for people in the pews. Famously, a few years ago, there was an old, I think it was an old lecture or homily of Joseph Ratzinger's, discovered from like 1958, in which he talks about the people in the pews, again, with contempt. Like they're a bunch of pagans, basically. They don't know the faith. And there seems to be this widespread sense, again, in the post-war period among a lot of people in the church, and this apparently in the liturgical movement, where there's this idea that these people don't know what's good for them. We have to give them what's good for them, in terms of what their of what the liturgy should be. And I think it has to do with the development of this, this sense that they know the liturgy because they've studied it, because they have this quote-unquote scientific knowledge of the liturgy. And I say this because by the time you get to the eve of the Second Vatican Council, you definitely have to me, the stuff I've read in and around the liturgical movement by the late 50s, early 60s, says to me that they developed a very different idea of what they're doing than they were in the 1920s. They are experts now whose goal is to sort of get their ideas into circulation rather than merely bring the people to the liturgy as it exists. And one of the things that I see, again, and I'll show you in a second what I mean by this, is there's this sense that basically only sort of historical studies can really verify the liturgy. And I'll give you examples of this from what we're talking about here. In 1948, there was a sort of memorandum drawn up by what was then called the Congregation of Rites, the historical section for the Congregation of Rites, which talked about reform, made proposals for a future reform of the liturgy, but gave a sort of list of its principles for for what the reform should be like. I'll read this to you for a couple of reasons. It's very interesting. The technical term for this is the actual name is Memoria sulla Reforma Liturgica, 1948. And so read what it says here to give you an idea what I'm talking about. It says, quote, "Now a wise reform of the liturgy must balance the two tendencies, that is, conserve good and healthy traditions, verified on historico-critical bases, and take account of new elements already opportunely introduced and needing to be introduced. Since the liturgy is a living organism, so the liturgy, which is a continuous manifestation of religious vitality, cannot be something set in stone, rather it must develop as it in fact has developed in parallel line with all the other vital manifestations of the church," unquote. You can kind of already see there some of the things I've talked about, right? The idea that tradition has to be verified, right? Again, it uses this jargon, historico-critical bases. Historico-critical is, again, this is stuff you get from the secular world, right? This is the idea that you're not just looking for knowledge, like there's some sort of supreme method that has to be used to verify, and by, it says good and healthy traditions. You just can't take tradition on trust anymore. You have to verify it historically. And then, of course, taking kind of new elements, this idea that the liturgy develops, and therefore it says there, especially that passage, it's a continuous manifestation of religious vitality. Remember I mentioned vitalism, this idea that if you're not showing vitality, you're dead or something. I think I can see some of the influence there in a document like that. I'll give you another example. That's 1948. 1962, there was actually an assessment of the liturgical movement. This is right on the eve of the Vatican Council, by an English writer, Charles Davis, and he's going through and talking about, again, the importance of historical studies for the liturgical movement. I just want to read this passage here. He's talking about the progress of the liturgical movement. He has this to say. I'll read this. Charles Davis, I think it's Liturgy and Doctrine is the title of the book from 1962. Quote, "What happened was that the historical, doctrinal, and pastoral work brought the realization that our present liturgy was not in a healthy state. Historical studies laid bare the evolution of the liturgy and showed the reason why the liturgy had ceased to play the part in the ordinary Christian life that it should. One conclusion became clear. If vitality was to be restored to the liturgical life of the church, changes must be made. Historical studies made it possible to discern which changes should be foreign to liturgy and due to some unfounded modern fashion." Unquote. He goes on to say that there's a one-sidedness about the way the church had presented itself to the world. I'll read the whole passage here. He said, quote, "Owing to the need to combat various errors, attention was concentrated for centuries on the church as a visible and hierarchical society. This one-sidedness has been overcome by going back to the early tradition and digging out the rich data found there on other aspects of the church. It is the same with the liturgical renewal, a return to tradition to overcome the defects of the present. Pastoral necessity shows the need for reform," unquote. And so you kind of see all these various strands coming together where basically they're saying that the liturgy as we've received it, there's something wrong with it. And again, he's not saying there's anything, doctrinally wrong with it, but you've gotten, by the time you get to the 50s, a clear sense that liturgy itself needs to be changed. Because we have all this expert knowledge, right? We've been studying this stuff and we know so much better now than we did before about X, Y, and Z. And again, if you're wondering why I'm emphasizing this professionalization stuff and why I see influences from the modern academic world kind of infecting this, is that some of this stuff, this seems familiar to me from my experience of the secular academic world. Because one of the things that happens is you get this consensus building up in the liturgical movement by the end of the 1950s. There absolutely have to be make these changes, and some of the things they have a consensus on turn out to be wrong. I mentioned Odo Cosell's book. That's one thing, right? It was kind of based on stuff that wasn't quite accurate. The major sort of talking point in the 1960s, one of them was that led to the reforms as they actually happened, was of course the discussion of the Roman canon, right? The Roman canon was the only Eucharistic prayer ever used by the Latin Rite, by the Roman Rite, until the 1960s. And you began to get all these criticisms in the 50s and 60s of that canon. Why? It was taken to be kind of irrational, right? It had all these different elements to it that didn't make sense. It was, it was created for a certain time of place, and that place isn't there anymore. Therefore, we need to have a new canon. I'll give you an example of the kind of talk about this here. This is from a book by A.H. Reinhold, and he's quoting A.H. Reinhold's a German liturgical scholar, famous, migrated from Germany to the United States, and wrote a book, very good, very important book for understanding the liturgical movement, called Bringing the Mass to the People in 1960. And he's recounting one of these liturgical meetings in 1956, and the words of a monk from Buron, actually, delivered in Vienna at one of these conferences, Dom Paul Gordon. And he says, and this is worth quoting in full because of what it says, quote, stress the impermeability and opaqueness of the present rite of the Mass, which was a stopgap devised in 1570 under different cultural and scholarly conditions for the simple pastoral needs of the day. Many parts are too long, as e.g. the prayers at the foot of the altar, the offertory prayers. In the canon, we have lists of saints dictated by considerations of an earlier century and the local preferences of a city. It contains superfluous signs of the cross and amens, which minimize the sweep from the preface of the doxology, unquote. You get a good sense of that, of how they've come to view the liturgy by the end of the 50s. They don't see it as a sort of, whole, right? That it has a sort of perennial form that, yeah, there can be deviations from it, but the whole form is basically there. They've come to see it through their academic training largely as a sort of collection of arbitrary creations. Like that phrase the guy used there, Dom Paul Gordon, that the rite of the Mass of 1570 was a stopgap devised. It wasn't a stopgap. Nobody devised anything. But they've come to see it that way. Why? Because they've come to see the liturgy primarily through the lens of their academic training, as an object of study. And so they don't see the harm in changing. And again, he also, I'm parsing this for a reason. I think it's important, but, it's done for the needs of the day. In other words, again, everything is sort of specific to its time period and has a sort of shelf life to it. And you have to get rid of it once the shelf life is gone. That historicism I talked about earlier comes out here, I think. It means that you no longer see, as I said before, the liturgy has a form, right? A perennial form, an essential form, which can change in its details, by the way. It does. There are lots of changes. Some of them corruption, sure. But I would compare it to a human face, right? Human face changes every day because your skin, you lose skin cells, right? They get replaced every day. It's literally different skin cells every day. But nonetheless, your face is more or less the same as it was when you were a kid. It's probably fatter. It's probably puffier like mine, but it's the same form. And somewhere along the line, these scholars in the liturgical movement, I think, came to without saying so, but he didn't come out and say, well, the Mass is just an arbitrary fabrication. But they kind of talk like it without actually being aware of it. Sort of like a computer, right? A computer doesn't see a face, like AI, like computers, when they see an image of a face, because they have no concept of a face. All they see is a collection of pixels. Well, I think these reformers came to see the Mass as just this arbitrary collection of rites and gestures, which they, because of their superior knowledge, could put together better in light of present conditions by the 1950s. And I do think it is partly those influences I mentioned. And I mentioned this, I'll end this episode. This idea, by the way, and this is this idea that the liturgy doesn't have any perennial forms, came to me, by the way, reading something that Pope Francis said a couple of years ago. Actually, it was his Christmas address back in 2022. I can find this on my computer real quickly. 1 second. Now, here it is. And I wouldn't normally mention this, but I read this, heard this somewhere a couple of years ago. It caught my eye. This is his Christmas address to the Curia in 2022, December of 2022. And he says, Francis says this, and it struck me. He says that, I'll read the whole paragraph. The contrary of conversion is, quote unquote, immobility, the secret belief that we have nothing else to learn from the gospel. And this is the part I wanted to highlight here. This is the error of trying to crystallize the message of Jesus in a single perennially valid form. Instead, its form must be capable of constantly changing so that its substance can remain constantly the same. True heresy consists not only in preaching another gospel, as St. Paul told us, but also in ceasing to translate its message in today's languages and ways of thinking, unquote. And that came to me because I think that's exactly what you kind of have present in this liturgical movement by the time you get to the eve of the council, is this idea that there's no perennial form, and that the only thing that matters is you get a form that fits the era in which people exist, and then it has the backing of authority, which is, of course, what happens with the council. With the council, you have, they have basically an adoption of these ideas in some form. Again, Sacrosanctum Concilium won't go into here, but this idea that needs to sort of change in a certain way with the times, has become sort of ingrained in people's minds. But especially the idea that, because you can have change, it's not a problem. But the idea there's no perennial forms. He's probably, by the way, talking about doctrine in that passage I just quoted, Francis is, but easily applies in the liturgy. There's no sort of perennial, constant form that you have to sort of adhere to. You're constantly changing, like Proteus, like a Protean thing or something like this. I think, again, nobody's saying this consciously or explicitly among these liturgical movement figures. Not all of them, by the way, think this stuff. I think they've just gotten a habit of viewing these things this way. What they are conscious about, by the way, and I'll end it with this, is their sense of superiority, again, to people who aren't liturgical scholars. And that comes out really clearly. You read some of this stuff. It's really shocking in some ways. To read this stuff. And I'll go back even to someone like Baudouin I mentioned earlier. He, because one of the things that shocks me about this debate, right? This is a debate about the old Mass and what the Mass was like before the council. You get this assertion over and over again that everybody was a complete moron in the pews before the council. They had no idea what they were doing. They weren't paying attention. They were all praying their rosaries. And I wondered where this came from. And I think it comes from this idea that not only this idea of, the liturgical movement has, the arrogance of expertise, but if you go back even to Dom Baudouin, again, who was a great figure, by the way. I'm not trying to get personal here. He really wanted to help people. But even there, you have this sensibility that there are these people you want to help, a sense of being sort of superior to them a little bit. And there's something interesting about this. And again, I go back to the historical context in which Dom Baudouin, these people are writing, the two world wars, the Industrial Revolution, which has reshaped Europe. I say this because he talks about this. Remember, I talked about Dom Baudouin in his work, Liturgy of the Life of the Church, talking about individualism being a problem and having to give, almost raise the consciousness of people about the liturgy. He says this is a passage he's talking about. He says, this is when he's talking about the abandonment of prayer, right? This has happened because, he says this, quote, he says, "How can the ordinary people, the multitude of the faithful, surrounded as they are by the tempestuous affairs of our time, burdened with the things of the earth, acquire the wing necessary to raise themselves unaided to God? Our Holy Mother Church has not abandoned these privileged children to their isolation and personal weakness. She has produced for them a social environment which will supply their individual deficiencies, namely the liturgical gatherings, properly so called." And what I'm going to highlight in this next passage is what I want to get to here. But I'm going to dwell on this. I know I'm taking longer than I should have, but let me go forward here. He says, quote, "At these liturgical gatherings, association multiplies the energies and the capacities of the individual and creates a powerful atmosphere which will carry along the more feeble. A collective soul permeates the entire assembly. The phenomena of the psychology of crowds is pressed into the service of God. And that's the part I wanted to get to there. Again, there's this idea that, he's talking about, and by the way, if you know what crowd psychology is, this is the way that people act differently if they're in crowds. He's clearly got the idea that, again, you go back to the industrialization of the modern West. One of the things that happened in Western Europe is that the working classes deserted the church. Not just the Catholic Church, but religion in general, or organized religion. He's thinking about this stuff. It's in the background of his mind. But, people tended to think that, okay, workers, when they, you go into a factory, you do the same mindless job over and over again. You're just a sort of mindless automaton. Think about how people, when people talk about people before the Second Vatican Council as being mindless automatons, who were just doing things out of rote, right? Out of rote habit and routine. It sounds to me like they're talking about, they have this idea of the masses, right? The mass, a mass of undifferentiated, unthinking automatons. And there's clearly some of this getting into this characterization, because that was, by the way, the goal these people set out for themselves to solve. How can we help these people? And it seems like as they went along and they started coming up with ideas, and these ideas didn't take hold and people didn't like it, they sort of acquired an unearned contempt for the ordinary people in the pews because they didn't take their ideas seriously. And of course, when they got the chance, they basically, what happened with the Second Vatican Council is that you had a council and then a pope, Paul VI, give them carte blanche to go impose those ideas. Which again is the reason why they're there. I mean, that's one of the things that happened in effect was that the liturgical movement captured the institutions of the church, and which one reason, by the way, they hate the old rite. The old rite flourishing basically is a sign that they failed, which I think is the only thing you can kind of conclude from all this, is that a lot of this just seems like, they didn't, their original purpose, they sort of abandoned because they couldn't, I guess, raise the consciousness of the people enough in their minds to make them appreciate the liturgy. So they had to go change the liturgy, which again was supposed to lead to flourishing, which I don't know. I even if you think the reforms were great, how do you think this led to some sort of flourishing? It's just not a rational response to all this, but does account for me to wrap all this up finally. How am I doing here on time? Hour and 5 minutes. Okay, not too bad. Anyway, but accounts for some of the contempt I hear from the institutional church toward people that don't like the new liturgy. And again, I should have done this at the beginning. Full disclosure, I do attend a Latin Mass community, the FSSP place where I live. I don't hate the new liturgy. I just don't think it was a success. I attend it occasionally for a variety of reasons. By the way, you put a gun to my head, probably prefer Byzantine liturgies above anything else. But it's a preference for me. So, but anyway, the point is that, in a sense, what happened to the liturgical movement to cause the things that, some people think are bad after the council is in some ways it's institutional success. And that's at least the way I see it anyway. Now that I think about it, I think this whole I hope this episode wasn't too confusing. The way I'm talking about it now, it seems a little confusing. But I think those things sort of led them to sort of twist the original meaning of it, without even being too aware of it by the early 1960s. It's only when the actual reforms came out and you had a lot of conflict about it, I think that a lot of these ideas came to the fore, and people were amazing, excited for this stuff. But in any event, it's a sad story because you had all these good intentions, and they become slowly over time sort of twisted, at least in my view of things. Again, I take a more sort of gradualist view of these things. Maybe you think this isn't convincing. I don't know. In any case, anything you didn't understand or didn't like, let me know. Leave a comment. I'll put this up on YouTube eventually. Or comment on YouTube. Comment on the episode on Patreon or on Spotify. But that's my episode on the liturgical movement. What happened to the liturgical movement? And hope you enjoyed it. Upcoming episodes, next few weeks, you'll have some shorter ones. I'm doing a short biography, a couple of biographies, my little Catholic Live series. One on Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem in the Middle Ages, Crusader king. Also have an episode upcoming shortly on what I've been reading lately. So people liked that last year, so we'll do that again. So a couple of things upcoming soon in the next week. I'll be on the lookout for it. Thank you once again to all my listeners. Hope this is helpful for all of you. God bless you all. Have a great week. Take care, and you'll hear from me soon. God bless.